Hi there, everybody. Okay, shall we start the meeting, please? I know there may be more people coming in. If we can make it easy for latecomers to find a seat, which will be towards near the ends of the rows, that'd be really lovely of you. Thank you very much. And welcome, everybody, to this meeting. Welcome to Marxism. If this is your first day here, it's been absolutely amazing so far. I hope you're all enjoying it. I hope we have a really brilliant discussion today. Okay, so to introduce myself, I'm Celia Hutchison. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Manchester, this meeting is Marxism versus Queer Theory. And our speaker today is Michael Dance, and Michael is a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. He is also an activist in the National Education Union, the trade union, teachers' trade union, and in that he is also on the LGBT organising forum of his trade union. So Michael is going to speak for 30 minutes. Now, before we do all that, I just want to explain a little bit about the format of this meeting, what's happening with this meeting. This meeting is being live streamed and filmed. So if you wish to speak, we would ask you, if you can, and if you are happy to come to the front. If that's not okay, that's absolutely fine. We have people with mics like this, and they can bring the mic to you. I will explain more about how the discussion is going to run when we come to that. So let's leave that for now. Okay, so I would like to therefore welcome everybody to the meeting, whether you're watching on Zoom or whether you're here in the room, and I would like to, with no further waste of time, introduce Michael. Michael's going to speak for 30 minutes, after which we've got lots of time for discussion, then Michael will come back at the end. Michael, over to you.
Okay, the first thing I really want to talk about today is the title itself, because it looks like it's a battle between two very, very opposing sides. And while we do have arguments and discussions within the movement, it's very, very important that we locate that in terms of what is happening in the world today. Because the far-right forces across the world are attacking LGBT plus people, gender ideology, gender studies, all the courses where people talk and discuss ideas, and queer theory itself. So I think it's very important that we start by saying that we side with those people who are under attack, and we should stand in unity with anyone who comes under attack because of their queerness, and that we are against people like Orban in Hungary, the Polish government, Trump and his cronies and allies in the US, and so on. And that is really important. And, locating that in Britain today, I think it's very important to... Sorry, that's not... There you go. It's very important to understand what is happening in terms of the attacks in Britain, because these aren't my family photos, but they are. This was last week, which saw the fifth standoff between the forces of the far right and those counter-protesting to defend drag queen story time at the Honor Oak pub in Lewisham, South London. And I think in some ways it's the custom of drag queens telling stories to young people is in some ways a typical strategy that comes out of queer theory and the idea of queering. The idea of queering something like the reading for pleasure. It's the idea of disrupting norms, creating situations that question heteronormativity. And like so much of queer activism, it emerged in the US, initiated by Michelle T in San Francisco in 2015. And drag queen storytime has become the target for right-wing groups because they see it as a fertile area to attack and create division and gain popularity for themselves in terms of linking LGBT plus issues with grooming and paedophilia, and a way to attack gender ideology across the globe. And you can see the sort of people who were faced up to us last week down in Lewisham. A collection of hard right people, ex-Nazis or Nazis, and people who used to be in Combat 18 and Bloods and Roses, awful people who are trying to turn the anger in society against LGBT plus people and divide us. So in that sense, it's fundamental that socialists stand with the oppressed against the right, defending events like Drag Queen Story Hour. However, this meeting is part of a course called Liberation. And Marxism and queer theory have very different ideas and very different strategies and goals about how liberation can be won. And in the case of queer theory, it's actually questionable whether some queer theorists actually think that revolution can be achieved at all. So before I start to discuss some of the ideas in queer theory, I do want to talk about the word queer because, you know, when I was growing up, the word queer was used in a purely derogatory way, in a totally negative way. It was an insulting term used for LGBT people, which was a nasty term and an exclusionary term used to other its subject. And yet, you know, queer theory is something very different. The use of the term in the 90s was deliberately used to fight back and shock, showing that people were not going to take any more oppression. And groups like ACT UP and Queer Nation in the US took the righteous anger you know, over the terrible treatment of HIV, people with HIV and AIDS, and used it in terms of creating public stunts like die-ins to shock the reactionaries in George Bush's America in the early 90s. It was a reaction against conservatism of the USA and a wake-up call to more vibrant, positive forms of activism. So, queer theory, though, or the idea of queer theory, is quite difficult to pin down. It's not a coherent set of ideas, and it's a slippery beast in that way. Some people who are regarded as queer theorists don't necessarily regard themselves as queer theorists, and are sometimes even critical of it. Yet what most share is a rejection, of any grand narrative about repression created by forces of the state or from above, and tend to talk about sexuality as a discourse that involves different groups and forms of power in society. In many ways, the founding text of queer theory is Michel Foucault's book, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, The Will to Knowledge, published in Britain in 1979, well before the concept of queer theory existed. But Foucault's book breaks decisively with a Marxist understanding of sexuality in history. It breaks from the idea that sexuality was the subject of oppression from ruling class or bourgeois forces, and actually sexuality as a power came into existence from the 17th century, and in the 19th century developed its own dynamic. Foucault says, let us put forward a general hypothesis. The society that emerged in the 19th century, bourgeois, capitalist, or industrial society, call it what you will, did not confront sex with a fundamental refusal of recognition. On the contrary, it put into operation an entire machinery for producing true discourses concerning it. Not only did it speak of sex and compel everyone to do so, it also set out to formulate the uniform truth of sex. So far from the Victorian era being regarded as a repressive period with controls to support and bolster the family structure, outlaw homosexuality through the Labouchere Amendment in the 1880s, which led to the trial of Oscar Wilde, the taboos around sexual, referring to sex, social restraints on women. For Foucault, it's a period of growth in terms of sexuality and the discourse of sexuality and the flourishing of that. Foucault saw society not fundamentally as a class society, but as a collection of different powers that come into contact with each other, clash or diminish in specific instances. He says power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. There's a kind of tautology around it that is actually quite difficult to grasp, but you can only take it as a rejection of the idea that judgments in terms of class are being dismissed. And so when it comes to it, there's a rejection of what he calls the idea of repression from above. He says, hence, there is no single locus of great refusal, no soul of revolt, source of all rebellions, or pure law of the revolutionary. Instead, there is a plurality of resistances, each of them a special case. So, sexuality is presented as a series of separate battles taking place in different spheres of life with no overriding dynamic shaping, organizing, or controlling it. What queer theorists have taken from that, I think, and why it's such an important text for them, is that means they can make up and they make the rules on how they form that theory, and they can go outside of the traditional ideas about seeing things in terms of class. And so what developed really was kind of something that is formless in a way, but allows people to focus in on the element of sexuality as a discourse. But there's one catch with Foucault, I think, that really is a real problem. The last line in Foucault's book says, the irony of the deployment is in having us believe that our, quote, liberation is in the balance. And what he means by the deployment is the deployment of the idea that there is any repression or a battle between the state and ideas coming from above to control sexuality from below. And when he puts liberation into quotation marks like that, it's almost like he's saying that that is an illusion. The idea of liberation is a delusion. That's not possible. That's not the way society works. And so he takes it totally outside the realms of class society, and the idea that liberation is possible is really kind of seen as some sort of impossibility. So, the growth of queer theory, really, during the 90s and into the 21st century, it's flourished and spread into every area of life. So, you've got books on things like Queering the Renaissance, which looks at things like exploring masculinity in Elizabethan society, cross-dressing in Shakespeare's plays, focusing on people like Erasmus to kind of question whether he was queer. And queer theory has moved on into every sphere of life. You have queer gardening, queering Charles Dickens. I saw a book the other day, The Queer Theory and the Prophetic Marriage Metaphor in the Hebrew Bible. But queer theory has also, and I'll come on to the serious elements of it in a moment, also gone into discussing world politics and is used as a tool to do that. But however queer theory is used, it's more of a tool of analysis and not as a political strategy for liberation. That's not on the cards coming from it. So it has a limited aspiration in that sense. But on one level, it's broken into popular culture. In another level, it dominates academic ideas in some universities. So the growth of queer theory grew mainly in the 90s through American academics and in US universities. This developed in particular critiques in gender and sexuality and into areas like post-colonial studies, film and media studies, and sociology and psychology. But it's also, the word queer and queering have become part of ordinary everyday vernacular. So, when The Guardian reviews a Kylie Minogue song, Padam Padam, they use this language in everyday terms. This is what they said about Padam Padam. This is true diva dom, embodying the promise of liberation by insisting that a 55-year-old woman singing about being gripped by the desire to go home and shag a perfect stranger is pop music, is profoundly sexy and deserves to sit at the centre of culture. Her fans are queering the idea of the female pop star sold by an industry of limited imagination. I mean, this is where we've gone, you know, it's gone into everyday terms like that. On the other hand, you've got something like Petrus Liu's new book, The Spectre of Materialism, which looks at how relations of gender and sexuality get reconfigured to meet the needs of capital in new regimes of accumulation and dispossession, focusing in on US-Asian economic relations. So queer theory is used about Kylie Minogue, the next minute it's talking about world capitalism and used as a tool to do that. The most important theorist of queer theory, I think, is Judith Butler. And, you know, in the last 30 years, she has become a very important figure. And even though she doesn't or didn't consider herself a queer theorist to begin with, her work, Gender Trouble, is probably, I think I've missed a few now. Yeah. Her work, Gender Trouble, is probably one of the most, is the most influential text on sex and gender in the last 30 years. I think it's important to say that, you know, kind of, her effigy has been burnt around the world. When she was speaking in Brazil, her effigy was burnt outside the theatre. You know, she's become a hate figure for the far right. Yet, I think Butler's ideas are far from revolutionary. They question traditional ideas about sex and gender. So she does say things like there's no one concept of gender. She talks about how gender is established through medical and legal frameworks. And of course, there's an acceptance of trans women under the identity of woman, good, questioning ideas about what it means to be a woman, or, you know, interesting, important ideas, really. I suppose she's most famous in a sense for her ideas about drag and the idea that gender can be performative, and the idea that therefore she challenges a rigid binary and opens up ideas about gender for discussion. She says gender ought not to be construed as a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts follow. Rather, gender is an identity tenuously constituted in time, instituted in an exterior space through a stylized repetition of acts. So, you know, all well and good, but there's no mention of liberation, there's no idea about that. I've only got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to really focus in to the difference now between Marxism and what queer theory represents. And I think, you know, kind of when we talk about what Marxism or Marxists say about sex and gender and ideas about that, it's there's a huge difference. Marxism does attempt to challenge oppression, aim to transform the world and eliminate oppression once and for all. I don't think queer theory can claim that. I want to go back to that last line of Foucault's Will to Knowledge, where Foucault mocks the idea about liberation, or the idea of liberation. And I think we absolutely refute that argument. We totally believe that liberation is something that we organise around. We see sexual oppression as something real and fundamental, resulting from the reality of living in class society. That the family, in different ways, at different times of human development, has shaped and organised gender roles, attitudes towards sexuality, and created laws and customs that enforce them. We are historical materialists. That means we see that it's not ideas about sexuality that shape the world, but the other way around, that it is the material reality of the world that shapes those ideas, and then those ideas go back into the world. We locate the root of gender oppression in the material reality of the family, and, you know, kind of, you know, Engels' groundbreaking study, The Family, Private Property and the State, is still the starting point for a historical materialist understanding of how class society develops and changes, and that the form of the family in society adapts to that. All right-wing campaigns defend the family as sacrosanct, and that's no accident, because it is a defense of the way that capitalism organizes gender and sexuality. It's such an important thing for them. But queer theorists often have very little to say about the family. And I think after a revolution, we will be talking about what we want in society without having to look at the family as the fundamental unit in our society. We recognise the role of the state, which is rarely mentioned in queer theory again. And how can that be, really, when you think about it? Look at the repressive laws that have been created throughout the last 200 years. The laws of the 1880s to outlaw other, homosexuality and create real oppression. The role of the Nazis and the laws passed to close the clubs in Germany, and the concentration camps that resulted. Look at, Section 28, or in the US now, the Don't Say Gay law in Florida. All those things are repressive things that happen that you cannot possibly just ignore and say it's part of a discourse. It is part of something that we have to fight back in terms of class society. And we have to take sides and fight with those who are oppressed against the oppressors. And with class struggle, we see the possibility of defeating the forces of oppression and building a new society through revolution, transforming humanity in the process. That through revolution, we can dig up the roots of oppression once and for all and plant the roots of a new society free from oppression. The struggles against oppression reached their height precisely at the times when class struggle does too. Homosexuality was decriminalised in revolutionary Russia in 1917, a full 50 years before supposedly advanced Britain. Advances in sexual freedom came in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s at a time of revolutionary fervour in Germany. The struggle against apartheid produced the first constitution in the world to outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation. So it's, for us, it's no, we celebrate Stonewall riots that came at the same time as those people, as people were fighting back against the Vietnam War, the rise of the Black Panther movement, and the demands of the women's liberation movement. That is why Stonewall is so important. It's the birth of the fight against oppression. Lenin called every revolt to be a festival of the oppressed, and for every revolutionary to be a tribune of the oppressed. And we aspire in the Socialist Workers' Party to try and do that. And through revolution, we can transform humanity and start to build a society where LGBT plus oppression will become a matter of history to be studied and analysed in universities. Marxism can be a guide for how to unite LGBT plus people with heterosexual workers today and people of any gender or sexuality to struggle against the system. And I just want to really get you to think about this at the end, really, because, I want to ask you a question. If you look at British Social Attitudes, which is produced every year, it's produced every year. In 1983, only 17% of people thought it was not wrong to be LGBT+. In 1987, that dropped down to 11% not wrong. But by 2013, 63% were in favour of same-sex marriage. How did that happen? And that's a question I want to ask you, really. How did that change around? And that's in my lifetime. I think it's very important. And I think there are reasons for that. I think you have to see it as part of a struggle that has been ongoing, but has been ignored. In 1984 and 85, LGBT plus activists made a connection with the South Wales miners. It was historically important that that happened. But what happened after that? In 1986, Arthur Scargill went to the Labour Party and said, right, we are supporting LGBT plus rights. That happened in every trade union between 1987 and right through the 90s, until the whole of the movement was actually transformed in terms of the attitude to LGBT plus people. And I think, kind of that, I see that change as rooted in the struggle and the organisation that people have in unions, but also the effect that those ideas had in terms of coming out of that struggle. And I think that's really, really important to understand. It wasn't David Cameron, who was nice and granted same-sex marriage. It wasn't Tony Blair who was being nice by abolishing Section 28. That was produced because the pressure and the changes of society that were going on. And I think that's really important to understand. Let me just put, not yet. And I'm really proud of this because I don't know if you were in Laura's meeting on yesterday, but this was a group of NEU activists who brought all their banners to Trans Pride 2 years ago in 2021. We got a third of the London region there. It was massively brilliant. It totally changed the mood in the union and has been part of changing the mood in the NEU. Which used to have some people at the top who had transphobic ideas. There's been a sea change, but it's because people did things. It's because people, have changed that. And that is going to continue this year. And it's really, when you look at what is happening now with all the attacks on trans rights, all the attacks that I started off with on gender studies across the world and the rest of it, and gender ideology, it is really important that we make the link between working class organisations and the oppressed who are fighting back. And so what we've done over the last couple of weeks, we've had the success in getting NEU members and NEU banners onto Trans Pride. This year, we've done something even better, I think, which is to bring other unions involved. So we have the RMT LGBT plus committee banner, UCU, London Region, the St Mungo Strikers are going to be there with their banner. And then we've got other unions that are coming alongside a load of NEU groups. It's brilliant that that is happening. It actually it's great to see. It's a representation of unity. It makes trans people feel that they are supported, but it also changes the politics in the union about, in terms of making a positive atmosphere in terms of the fight against depression. So I'm really looking forward to that Trans Pride, which is next Saturday, and really welcome everybody to come along. But this is what really what is important. We do have the potential to unite workers with those people who are oppressed. Many of those who are oppressed are workers themselves. We need to forge that unity and fight back, and then we can start to challenge the Tories and their scummy ideas that they've got about, restricting what teachers can do in schools and attacking trans students and forcing them to come out. We are in a good position to build some opposition to that. And that really is what is important. But more than that, if we link those ideas, not just in London, but across the world, we have a chance to defeat capitalism and try and shape a new society where these things become something that we control, not somebody controlling us. And so I just want to go back to Foucault again. Liberation is possible. Liberation is worth fighting for. We can do that by linking the working class with the people who are oppressed, and we can win.
And by the way, I don't know anyone's names, by the way, and so it's going to be you in the blue T-shirt and stuff. So you in the blue T-shirt, and then yourself in the pink, and then I'll have to write things down. Okay.
Yeah, Michael's talk's really interesting because I actually joined the SWP in 1995 after coming to a meeting on LGBT liberation because it explained what happened to me when I worked in the cinema a few years earlier. I was outed in the cinema and I got a load of homophobic abuse. I got hope you love age, you bastard every day, you're queer, you know, and all that. And management then sacked me. And every single person in the cinema, including the homophobes, supported me against the management. And after that, their homophobia died down. The racism towards the one mixed person on the staff, that died down. And people started asking why we haven't had a pay rise for 2 years. And actually so that just turned the mood around completely. And that's, you know, when you talk about, you know, people fighting oppression, well, what does queer theory have to offer me in a workplace when I'm being sacked? I mean, bear in mind, in this country, there was no legal protection for being sacked for being LGB until 2003. Okay, that's another of the changes that Michael didn't mention, but you know, that's one of the legal changes that was one. And it's actually what happened. And when I was outed and sacked, the attitude of some of my LGB friends was, well, it's your fault for letting yourself be outed, and you know, what else do you expect? So you know, there wasn't any solution for me there. So that's, you know, I think it's absolutely key. The problem we've had is, you know, I went on and we got legal protections, but actually when I had homophobic abuse with my union, I was supposed to work for nearly over 20 years, I actually complained about that and the union didn't want to know. And actually my union, a few years ago, it completely abolished its LGBT advisory committee. You know, we'd started doing presentations, we were going to Pride, so we're taking our banner to Pride. So I don't know if someone's still got that banner, but we've got one national officer now who looks after it along with various other issues. And somebody on the National Executive Committee, but we don't have the annual conference that we used to have of LGBT activists. We don't have the advisory committee. We don't have the ability to go and do presentations to branches, to committees, to the National Executive that we had started doing, and they've shut all that down. So all these gains that have been won in the unions, some of the unions like the National Education Union doing well, but other ones not so well. And I just think there is still a massive battle to be fought, and I think it's also partly because in the unions, you know, they say social issues are not economic issues, and actually, as somebody who's been sacked for being gay and won my job back, they bloody well are.
Can you take the mic? Take the mic, please.
Hi, so I've got a few points to make. So kind of like just to build on just the person who just spoke. I also found it very interesting that you implied that union support is something that really truly contributed to those statistics changing. And I believe that there are many other contributors to that and many variables that you're not considering necessarily. And also, when you are saying statements like that and implying those sorts of things, it's very important to consider your stance of privilege, because that can be rather triggering for some people. And a couple of other things. So Judith Butler, she didn't mean that gender is a performance. She didn't talk about drag. She talked about the performative nature of gender, and those two things are indeed very different. So what she was pointing at was the social construction of gender rather than the performance, or drag as yourself mentioned. Also, one of the things that I also wanted to touch on was you mentioning that queer theory is now so widely, the term is, or like terms of queer theory are so widely used nowadays. They've trickled through the masses into popular culture and are often misused, which I completely agree as well. But so we see that happen with Marxist terms such as alienation as well, with many psychological terms such as, I don't know, gaslighting, for example. So to say that queer theory is not as serious because it's being misused and to try and bring it down in a way that using this argument, I think, is a little bit weak, and you've not considered how the same exact thing is happening with many Marxist terms and many psychological terms and so on. So yeah, those are just like the couple of points that I wanted to make. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, I'd like Michael, you and then yourself. You could use that mic. Oh, yeah, that, whatever. Thank you. Thanks.
I'm a lesbian mum of both a biological child and a non-biological child. My non-biological child is, I'm not on her birth certificate. She can't inherit from me. Those are sort of, in lots of ways, first world problems. But one of the things that happened throughout my life, because I travelled for work, was that there was a constant challenge about whether the conditions that extended to normal families included my non-biological child. And I've been a union member all my life and never got any support on that sort of issue because it wasn't seen as a union issue. So I guess, and I'm really pleased that things are changing and that some people are sort of joining the struggle now, but it feels like a favour still, to me anyway. And maybe that's because I'm old and I have this bad history, but I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done by the union movement to really think about where we fit, how our rights fit, and how we can really be included in a movement that we want to be part of. And so just to finish off on your sort of original story about gays supporting the miners, we had to make the first move. We had to prove that somehow we were worthy of the support, which we then got back in spades. And I want that to stop. I want this thing of it's a favour to stop, and this thing of we have to make the first move and prove that somehow we're worthy of being considered as workers to stop. And I think that's something we need to, in the movement, continue to work on. Thanks.
Thank you. So yourself here, followed by...
Okay, I'll admit I am trans. Yeah.
Solidarity.
Yeah. As I say, I'm the first woman over there, solidarity with you. I believe the unions have got lots of work to be done. There's a little story, and it's not that, guess what year it is. A woman doing a job as a care worker. Two of her support workers had a conversation about her. She got sacked because the person, well, rather failed a probation, because the person she was intended to work with could no longer cope with her gender identity. The union, her union, did not support her. Her union said it was a losing battle. And that's how I feel. I feel I'm fighting, I feel I'm exhausted. And the problem is that now, the far right is getting more subtle. I'm being branded a paedophile, and politicians do not like to go against any law to stop paedophiles. That's how I feel. My question is this: where now? Still feels like it's happening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for contributing today. After the speaker here, if I can ask yourself, yes.
Hiya. Yeah, so we had a bit of a discussion about the term queer, and I think it is an important discussion because it is used almost universally. When you go to any kind of trans demo, when you go to any kind of pride, people will interchange queer with LGBT plus, with LGBTQ plus, and so on. And for me, queer means a bit different, a bit odd, a bit weird. And I don't see myself as different or weird. I'm gay, sure. I'm trans, sure. But I don't think that's a strange thing to be. So I don't feel proud when I say I'm queer, and and it's for that reason that I don't say I'm queer, and it really angers me. But the other thing about it is I think it reflects the nature of I would say movement, but I don't think they're trying to build a movement, the nature of the organisation and grouping that they're trying to build. Because what people do is try to create queer spaces, try to create queer groups, which are very closed off, very isolated, but safe spaces for themselves and people they know. And, you know, I'm all for safe spaces. That's a wonderful idea. And I like talking to trans people. I often feel a lot safer, you know. But at the end of the day, is that going to win liberation? I don't think so. I think the way you win liberation is through a mass movement. And that's why it's wonderful that for the past 3 years, the trans pride has been increasing by 5,000 people every single year. I hope it's 20,000 people strong this year. And trans pride in London. We also can't forget trans prides locally. I'm in Manchester SWP now, but until a month ago I was in York SWP. Earlier this year, we had a vigil for Brianna Jai. And let's not forget, by the way, transphobic murder happens all around the world and is absolutely on the rise. There's an excellent art project I'll tell you about if you can find me afterwards. We had a vigil in York which had as many people as Manchester did. Bear in mind, Manchester City 5 times the size. And we had half as long to build this demo. It was because myself and other people in the organising group had connections with the movement and tried to look outwards and push outwards. And by the way, at that demo, we raised 70 quid. Oh, sorry, this wasn't Brianna. This was the Section 35, stopping Section 35 of the GRRB in Scotland. We raised 65 quid for striking ambulance workers and took that solidarity to their picket line. That's the kind of movement that can win liberation.
Thank you. Perfect, Simon, thank you very much. Okay, yourself followed by in the blue shirt and the glasses, thank you. Yeah, that's okay. Absolutely, you're fine there. Just yeah.
I thought that was a brilliant talk, and there's been really good points made so far as well. I thought it was interesting, you know, talking about the Teachers' Union, and I'm in the Teachers' Union in Scotland, the EIS. And I think it's so important that these issues should be dealt with in schools, which I've done a lot of, not because I'm a hero or anything, but because I'm a big socialist. But you know, I don't think it should be part of the curriculum that are being dealt with. You know, like something that I would deal with. I used to have all these posters outside my classroom, and a lot of kids, you know, pupils would come to me if they'd been, you know, victims of abuse. And I remember a third year group once to do an assembly, and it was absolutely brilliant. You know, they actually did this, spoke in front of the whole year group. And I thought it was great. I always remember how they started it off, because the people that started it off went, "Oh, that's so gay," because that was, you know, an expression that would be used. And then he said, "How would you feel if you were gay and you were speaking this to the whole audience?" And that was being used in a really, you know, just to make you feel awful. And it was absolutely brilliant the way the pupils dealt with it. And after that, you know, and after dealing with it in the classroom, you know, a lot of them would come to me about issues. But I remember once some of them come to me and saying, "Miss, just want you to ask you this. I mean, because obviously you feel so strongly about it, but are you gay?" And I thought the best way to respond was to say, "Well, as it happens, I'm not gay, because that's like saying that you need to be black or Asian to be anti-racist. We've got to fight for equality for everyone and to change our society," because they all knew I was a big socialist as well. But it shouldn't just be down to, you know, this is making me out some kind of hero. I'm not. But it's so important that it shouldn't just be down to somebody's viewpoint. That should be part of the curriculum. And I would say that it's definitely not the case in Catholic schools, but other schools as well. And it wasn't really part of the curriculum in our school. But it shouldn't be down to somebody having those views. It should just be something that's dealt with, so that if young people are experiencing, you know, abuse, you know, homophobic or transphobic or whatever, it shouldn't be that they, well, go along and speak to Ms. McGinley because she feels so strongly about it. It should be all staff that they can go and speak to them about it. So I think it's so important that we really fight for that. So power to the people, comrades.
Thank you. Yes, and after this speaker, yourself, yes.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Tomasz. I head up the LGBT plus caucus in the SWP. I just want to make 2 points. Firstly, I think it's really important to think about the context from which queer theory emerged. And there's kind of 2 factors there. First of all, is that the Stonewall riots, give birth to the modern gay liberation movement, are part of a radical upsurge that takes place, the Black Power movement, the women's liberation movement, anti-colonial movements, and so on. And these have the ability to shake the system, but they don't actually manage to get rid of it. And the workers' struggles of the 1970s are impressive, but also go down into defeat during the late 1970s. And therefore, a general idea of changing the world or changing social relations through revolution and so on isn't really something that many people believe, including on the left. And there's a retreat from that sort of idea. And at the same time, a kind of a more entrenchment of identity politics, the idea, really ideas that if you don't experience a particular oppression, you don't have any interest in fighting for liberation, and a fragmentation takes place in the movement. In the 80s then, I think there's partly a reaction against all that kind of fragmentation that takes place, partly through the kind of fights around the HIV and AIDS crisis, but at the same time, there still isn't that idea you can change the world. And I think queer theory emerges both as a kind of wanting to be more radical and a kind of reaction against some of that fragmentation that takes place in the 80s, but also still doesn't have the idea that you can really change the world through revolution. I think that shows, why there are some real kind of, we can agree on some things with queer theories, but why there is actually a difference when it comes to strategy and so on. Then I just want a second point I want to say is, well, various people have talked about the importance of class in this meeting, and I think we should think about why we're talking about that. First of all, I don't think we're pointing towards class just because we think working class people are automatically on the side of liberation or have progressive ideas or socialist ideas. Firstly, it's to say, if oppression is rooted within class society and capitalism and the role of the family, then we need to think, what is the social force that could actually break that system? And I think working class people, because of their position within capitalism, have a unique ability to strike back against that system because they're the source of profits. The second thing is, I think identity is incredibly important. I think we have to be with any movement that's fighting back, but organizing on the basis of a shared identity isn't actually enough to win liberation. Think of Cressida Dick, who used to be the head of the Metropolitan Police Force. Did she experience homophobia and sexism? Of course, you couldn't be in the Met and not do that. However, when it came to Clapham Common, did she still send in the cops against the demonstration against sexism? Yes, on the orders of Priti Patel, an Asian woman Home Secretary. And that's because her class interests are to defend a system that nonetheless perpetuates that oppression. So we can't just look towards a unity of all of the oppressed across class. That we have to look to try and win a position against oppression amongst working class people, because that's the force that could potentially uproot it.
Thank you. Okay, look, there's lots of you who want to speak, so I'm going to bring this down to 2 minutes to try to get everybody in if you can. Okay, all right, tall order. So comrade here, and then I've got somebody right at the back, if perhaps you'd like to, yes.
So the speaker...
You choose. Yeah.
Well, the secret of good comedy is timing, so we'll see how we go. I'm Simon, I'm a journalist on Socialist Worker. Just to encourage you to buy next week's Socialist Worker as well as this week's Socialist Worker. We have an excellent article by one of our comrades on the Russian Revolution and LGBT plus liberation. I say that because the most important thing that I thought Mike said about differences, because we do have to talk a bit about differences, is that question of liberation. I don't think people should come away from this thinking it's a choice of queer theory versus trade unionism. I'm for good trade unionism, I'm for political trade unionism, I'm for trade unionism who's been forced to take up important issues. But I'm actually interested in liberation. I'm interested in changing the world. The best respect to the glories of the British labour movement. Trade unionism is a road that we have to go along, but it's not the route. And I want to say that because I think there's an interchange of dialogue that's important to remember with this, that our movement went through periods of great liberation, which I'll try and end on if I have time, at the beginning of the last century. But for a chunk of the middle of it, because of Stalinism, it didn't. And it took the movement, the gay liberation movement, to remind socialists of their own tradition and get socialists to get back on board, to be honest. It was a bit hidden. And that is important for us, because that means there's a dialogue. The dialogue that took place in the 80s over AIDS with ACTA. I remember the Queer Nation rows. They weren't very pretty, to be honest. I don't think either side was very polite about it.
30 seconds.
God. But it was actually really important. And I think that question mark at the end of the verses is actually quite important in the title. This is a dialogue of building a movement for liberation. If I get 35 seconds, I'll try and say what I wanted to say about the Russian Revolution. The gay community in Russia before the Russian Revolution was divided on two lines, aristocrats and simple people. I look around the room, I see a lot of simple people and not many aristocrats. After the revolution, the photo that illustrates the article of the newspaper you're all going to buy is a picture of a wedding of 95 gay sailors, all in various states of what now we would describe as drag. And one woman dressed as a man. I'm making no judgments on anyone's actual identity. It's very difficult to do that in the context. They were attempted to be framed as being subversives in the Navy. They won their case. None of them were charged. That liberation, and indeed that party of revolutionary LGBT plus sailors, as we would now call them now, happened because of revolution. That's how we get liberation.
Okay, so I am having to draw this discussion to a close at this point. Not quite yet, but just so you know. So if I can call, so after yourself, if I can call you in the cap, that's okay, yourself? Did you? Okay, that's absolutely fine. Please go ahead and I'll come back to you.
I mean, I want to start off by giving absolute solidarity to trans people in the UK today, because I don't know about anyone else, but I am absolutely pissed off with the press, the internet, and so-called feminist groups who I may say have done absolutely nothing for women apart from trying to attack Gillick competence and abortion rights, say that they are speaking for me, and they are not. Trans women are women, trans men are men, and non-binary people are valid. And I think that's extremely important that we start from that point. And that, I think, is why this is so important. Now, I look at the gender critical movement with its attacks on Gillick competence, its latest attacks from Kathleen Bloody Stock on abortion rights, and its anti-Semitism running through. And I think, gosh, you're useful idiots to the Tories, aren't you? And now they're anti-union. Their latest thing is attacking UCU, not on the basis that Joe Crady is undermining the strike, but on the basis that UCU in Edinburgh opposed a transphobic film. What a bloody disgrace. I just want to come back very, very quickly on the comment that said, you know, we have to ask for stuff in the unions. I don't think we have to ask. I think we need to be arguing our demands, because the working class is not something over there, away from trans people, away from LGBT people. The working class is black, white, Muslim, Jewish, gay, straight, cis and trans. And we are united, and when we are united, we are strong. I think this is a tremendous opportunity to show the bloody bigots that actually we are some sort of force, that the NEU will not put up with the bloody transphobic crap that the Tories are coming out with, and actually fight within the unions that says actually workers are not going to implement your policies, and let's show them where the real power lies.
Okay, I'm going to borrow this mic. I feel like it. I think, comrades, I'm going to have to ask this speaker to be the last one. I'm so sorry to all the people I wanted to call and wasn't able to call, but I hope we could be able to continue discussion in other meetings. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to carry on from the last speaker. And well, first of all, I think it's brilliant the Socialist Working Party putting trans rights so much to the fore of what we talk about. And I've really seen, I think what I wanted to say really was just to talk about how important it is that revolutionaries and other people on the left in the trade unions are making that very active intervention, because on the one hand, I think I'm in the UCU, I'm bisexual, I'm in the UCU, and what I've really noticed in the last, years in the UCU is just how much the union has shifted to the left, and I think that's because of the attacks we've faced on our pensions, our pay. We've also seen a whole number of our younger people come onto our branch committees, and that's really transformed, even a place like Oxford University where I am, where you would think it's very kind of conservative. Well, it's all changed for that. But I think what's really I've noticed also in the conferences is just how important it is that people on the left in the union are putting forward those arguments for LGBT rights. We have debates every year, we always have votes about trans rights, and it's really shifted in that sense. And maybe that's why we're under attack, just like we're also under attack for having, I think, the right stance on the war in Ukraine. We think, yeah, it is, about Putin should go out of Ukraine, but it's also about NATO as well. And it's partly because I think our kind of work, our strikes and the rest of it as revolution, has radicalised people, but it's also about activists within the union putting those arguments forward, and that's what's really shifted. And we've had big debates. We've had people who say they're feminists. I think they are. They think they're feminists. Coming out against what we're saying about trans rights. So the difference a revolutionaries make to all of this is absolutely critical. And I think one of the reasons this is so important, because somebody I think was saying that sometimes feel things are going backward, and we all know that how that can happen. Germany in the late 20s, amazing kind of culture there in Berlin. Trans rights. LGBT rights, and yet it was all smashed, wasn't it, by Hitler, people in the concentration camps. And that's the problem with class society, why we need to move beyond that, because ultimately it can all go backwards. But actually at the moment, we can build on what's happening in the growing struggle, but we've got to put all these things to the fore, and that means the more revolutionaries we have in the unions, putting these arguments, that's what makes a difference. It's an activist thing, so the more people, join the Socialist Worker Party and build that, it's going to make a crucial difference the years ahead.
Everybody for your contributions, and as I say, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to call everybody, but I've got a couple of announcements before I ask Michael to come back. First of all, I just want to draw your attention to some of the books here. Those books are available to buy at our bookmarks, which is in the main building where you registered. Then you'll see the bookstop at the back. These are some of the many books you can find there in the bookmarks shop. Two other things. A very important announcement, and that is that the session with Noam Chomsky, which is tonight at 6:30, has been moved into the Beveridge Hall. You'll need to ask the team people where that is. It says here, the Beveridge Hall can be found in Senate House, just past the ticket desk and bookmarks bookshop. You will be directed, you will be able to find it. It's going to be a big meet, it's going to be amazing. The second announcement, we're delighted that Soweto Kinch, the award-winning saxophonist and MC, will be performing at Mully's Bar tonight after the last session. Sounds good. All right, okay, so now I'm going to ask Michael to sum up, and you've got about 10 minutes so we can finish the meeting on time.
Okay, thanks. I just want to start. Can you hear me? Sorry, is that on? Okay, you can hear me now. Okay, I just want to start with Merlin's, where Merlin started, and I think he's absolutely right. What does a worker will ask? What does queer theory offer me? And I'm not sure what the answer is to that, except not very much. And I think it's really important. I think he's right also to say that, I hope I didn't give the impression that unions have got it all sussed, whatever. It's not the case. It's really important that these arguments are taking place, and it's totally uneven, isn't it? In some unions, there's massive progress. In others, there's none. In some areas, kind of huge strands. It's the same in the NEU in schools. If I have to say it, there are hugely brilliant things going on in schools, in some schools. In some schools, there's nothing going on, and everything in between. And we have to try and work on that to try and get a response that is consistent and supportive to everybody. When it comes to Judith Butler, I think, first of all, She does talk about drag. You're right to say that there's a difference between performativity and performance. But I think the problem with Judith Butler, and to be honest, everything I've read by Judith Butler, I've got no massive disagreement. But the problem is that it's very limited. It's limited because she does not mention the working class. And that is part of the problem. There is no political engagement with an idea or an agency to change the world. Therefore, it's a matter of ideas and relationships between groups and powers in society, but never the big picture about what is going on in society. And that is the problem. And, you know, kind of the idea about talking about, you know, how things change between the 80s and now, again, I'm not trying to say and reduce it all down to just what, you know, unions did this and that's what changed it. But that was a massive thing that is totally ignored by queer theory, totally ignored often in the trade union movement itself. And that's why I'd like to say, you know, one of the books up here, probably people haven't heard of it, but it's a really great book about what happened in the trade union movement in Britain between the 1950s and the present day. And there are brilliant stories in there about how individuals fought back and how unions were one to support them and how that has changed over time. I'd really recommend it. And I think it's not a privilege to talk about the role of unions in that. It is very important. And in fact, part of the problem, I think, with queer theory is because it only talks about the relationships between different groups and doesn't talk about the whole of society, it means that the strategies that have come out of it, and this is probably not the place to talk about it, but it will be in other meetings, issues like privilege theory, allyship, and intersectionality, there are issues around those, and those issues sometimes hold back the movement. Privilege theory can actually mean that only oppressed people should talk about their oppression. I think everyone should be talking about oppression and fighting back on it. Allyship sounds great, but you know, it's good to be an ally, but it's not if the ally has to be passive and only listen to what you know, kind of oppressed people say. We want to go further than that. We want to talk about everyone being a tribune of the oppressed. Everyone who's in the SWP is expected to stand up for trans rights and the rights of non-binary people. Everyone has to be anti-racist and do something about it. Everyone has to stand against women's oppression. It's so important that we do not say that, you know, kind of privilege means you can't do those things. It's really important that we have that. I just want to talk also about, you know, kind of what some people said about, what Kate and Thomas said about class. I think it's absolutely central, because if we don't talk about class, and I'm sorry, I've looked through Gender Trouble, I can't find any reference to it. I just think it's so important, because that is where we can unite together to change society. And it's when we unite together to fight against capitalism and then take on capitalism and then destroy capitalism, and then you have the grounds to build a new society. What will that society look like? And that's the exciting thing for me, is that if we're not all in families, if we're not all, you know, kind of trapped in a box in terms of our identities, where will things go? And that's the exciting thing about socialism. That's the exciting thing about what our society will look like after a revolution. And that will only be shaped by the people who are there at that time, who will make that new society. And good bloody luck to them. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Brilliant meeting. See you in the next meetings.